In the late 1850s, the United States was one country divided in two. Secessionists of the South and disunionists of the North believed that to live together as one nation had become impossible.
No two nations on earth are or ever were more distinctly separate and hostile than we are.
As calls for secession mounted, the question that demanded an answer was this: was the United States one indivisible nation, or was it a compact between sovereign states, which could be unmade by any state that chose to secede? For one man who was just beginning to emerge on the national political scene, the answer was certain. The Union was perpetual.
He is uneducated, his manners are uncouth, he wants dignity and reserve befitting his station, and has a vile habit of telling dirty stories.
Abraham Lincoln was a far cry from the typical politician of his day. Raised on a farm, Lincoln spent his 20s wandering and working at a series of odd jobs. But he took an early interest in politics, and in order to pursue a political career, he took up the law. After serving several terms in the Illinois state legislature, in 1846, Lincoln was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. Over the next few years, his views on slavery would take shape.
He had developed early in his life the belief that when you work hard, you deserve what you get, so it's a fruit of your labor, and kind of the feeling that this is a free labor society, that if you work hard, you get what you deserve.
Following a single term in Congress, Lincoln returned to Springfield, Illinois. There he pursued a successful career as a lawyer. But in 1854, he was drawn back into active politics by the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
He was torn deeply by the passage of this law because to him it upset everything the Founding Fathers had brought together in Philadelphia back in the 1780s. He believed that these Founding Fathers had set forth a series of principles based upon natural rights to the point that somewhere down the line, slavery would come to an end. But the Kansas-Nebraska Act had opened the idea of popular sovereignty, which meant theoretically slavery could go anywhere. And to him, that was just, it was blasphemy.
Because the Republican Party was now the vehicle for preventing the expansion of slavery into the territories, Lincoln, in 1855, made the decision to become a Republican, and by 1856 had emerged as the leading Republican in the state of Illinois.
In 1858, Lincoln was nominated by the Illinois State Republican Convention as the Republican candidate for the Senate. His Democratic opponent was the incumbent Senator Stephen Douglas. The speech Lincoln gave upon his acceptance of the nomination was a watershed. He directly challenged the prevailing attitude of political moderates and conservatives that the country's division over slavery could go on indefinitely.
A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect that it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other.
Stephen A. Douglas is perhaps the most important and famous politician in Illinois at the time, and he has been responsible for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So the House Divided speech is a speech in which Lincoln kind of steps forward as the person who's going to be the point man for opposing Douglas's position on slavery, which is the position of popular sovereignty.
To increase the visibility and momentum of his campaign, Lincoln called his opponent out.
Lincoln was known in certain areas, but certainly not that well known, not as much as Douglas. And so what you do is you challenge a person like Douglas to a series of debates. And of course, the debates were focused on a number of issues, but in particular on slavery.
Those of you who believe that the Negro is your equal, of course, will vote for Mr. Lincoln.
I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, but in the right to eat the bread which his own hand earns. He is my equal, and the equal of Judge Douglas, and the equal of every living man.
At Freeport, Illinois, Lincoln baited a trap for Douglas, arguing that his doctrine of popular sovereignty was illegal in light of the Dred Scott decision.
In that decision in 1857, the Supreme Court said there was no power in the country that could keep slavery out of the territories. Slavery was constitutional, it was in the Constitution, and people had every right to take their slaves into the territories wherever they might be. Well, that is a slap at Douglas's popular sovereignty, because Douglas is arguing the people who live there are the ones that should make the decision. So Lincoln had people urging him to catch Douglas up here, drive him into a corner.
Judge Douglas, can the people of United States territory in any lawful way exclude slavery from its limits prior to the formation of a state constitution?
Douglas had been asked that before. He didn't hesitate whatsoever. He says it didn't matter what the Supreme Court might rule now or in the future. The people in the territories have the right and have the power to keep slavery out of their territories simply by passing unfriendly legislation with respect to slaveholding. They could tax it outrageously so that no slaveholder could afford to have slavery, and there are a number of ways they can keep it out.
This answer became known as the Freeport Doctrine, and in the South as the Freeport Heresy.
I think this was probably one of the most politically ingenious steps that Lincoln had carried out at this time, because what it did was to force a deep split within the Democratic Party. It forced the Southerners to leave Douglas and the Northerners in the Democratic Party to stay with him, and opened the way to Lincoln's own election.
Stephen Douglas defeated Lincoln to win re-election to the Senate that year. But in the long run, Lincoln had achieved something more important.
And these debates, because Stephen Douglas was the #1 Mr. Democrat in the North, catapulted Lincoln into the national press. And because he made such a good showing against Douglas, debated him on an equal plane, people in Massachusetts, in New York, and elsewhere in the country began to ask, who is this prairie lawyer, Abraham Lincoln, who is challenging Stephen Douglas and holding his own against him?
When several Midwestern papers suggested him as a candidate for the upcoming presidential election, Lincoln demurred, but his popularity was growing, as was his ambition.
The turning point in Lincoln's interest in becoming president is when he is invited to give a speech at the Cooper Union in New York. What's the big deal about giving a speech in New York? The big deal is the leading candidate to become president is William Seward, who is an important New York politician, former governor of New York, now a senator. And so in effect, Lincoln was invited to Seward's backyard to give a talk about the current crisis of the nation. And Lincoln labored over this speech, and it was a huge hit, and it put him on a national map as many people's second choice to be the Republican nominee.
Neither let us be slandered from our duty by false accusations against us, nor frightened from it by menaces of destruction to the government. Let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it.
The Cooper Union speech was reprinted in the New York papers the next day and received glowing praise from all quarters.
Mr. Lincoln is one of nature's orators, using his rare powers to elucidate and to convince, though their inevitable effect is to delight and electrify as well.
Up to this point, Lincoln had been uncertain whether he would seek the Republican presidential nomination and had little confidence that he could win it if he sought it. But after the reception he received in New York and at other stops in New England, he was encouraged.
I will be entirely frank. The taste is in my mouth a little.
On the day that Abraham Lincoln spoke at Cooper Union, he presented himself at a photographer's studio to have what he called his shadow made. Matthew Brady was a fashionable portrait photographer of the era, whose sitters included Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, William Seward, Stephen Douglas, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. Using the latest technological developments in photography, Brady took striking photos that revealed his subjects in more detail and depth than the old-fashioned daguerreotypes. His photograph of Lincoln was the work of a master. Before taking the picture, Brady adjusted Lincoln's collar to conceal his long neck. Afterward, he retouched the negative, correcting Lincoln's left eye, which appeared to be roving upward, and softening the harsh lines in his face. In the final image, Lincoln looked statesmanlike and almost handsome. It was a work of art which Lincoln would later credit with making him president.
Talk, talk, talk. That will never free the slaves. What is needed is action. Action!
The abolitionist movement of the 1850s was filled with editors and orators who spoke out passionately against slavery at every opportunity. But John Brown believed action spoke louder than words, and following no one's conscience but his own, he took actions that would eventually eclipse all the words of all the abolitionists in America.
Without shedding of blood, there is no remission of sin.
For many years, John Brown had been developing a plan he believed would destroy slavery once and for all. Brown would invade the South and, by arming the slaves, ignite a rebellion.
After raising money and gathering some men to join him in 1859, John Brown goes to Maryland, sets up a campsite, and in October of 1859, he and 19 other men seize the United States arsenal at Harper's Ferry. And their plan is the slaves will come to them, and then they will go off into the mountains and fight the guerrilla war. Slaves don't come to them, in part because the slaves don't know that he's there, in part because the slaves aren't stupid. They can see that John Brown is totally outnumbered. John Brown manages to get himself surrounded. He lets a train go through Harper's Ferry is a major railroad stop, and so the train goes through and informs people that they're under attack. And eventually, the United States Marines show up under the command of an Army Colonel, Robert E. Lee, who will later, of course, become a Confederate general.
When Brown refused to surrender, the troops stormed the engine house.
Brown is captured. He's tried. The trial is something of a sham. Brown is suffering from wounds that he received during the battle. He asks for a delay of a couple of days so his lawyer from Ohio can arrive, and the judge refuses to delay the trial.
Weakened by his wounds, Brown appeared in court every day on a cot. Knowing the conclusion was foregone, he listened but said little. John Brown was sentenced to death by hanging.
In the month between the time he's convicted and the time he's hanged, Brown writes hundreds of letters across the country and essentially creates himself into a almost Christ-like martyr for northern opponents of slavery.
I've been whipped, but I am sure I can recover all the lost capital occasioned by that disaster by only hanging a few moments by the neck. And I feel quite determined to make the utmost possible out of a defeat.
John Brown was hanged on December 2nd, 1859. Across the North, meetings, prayer vigils, and church services were held to observe his death. These public displays of mourning outraged the South.
The North has sanctioned and applauded theft, murder, treason.
The South believes its own propaganda about John Brown. Southerners say all Northerners are like John Brown. In other words, they create John Brown to be, in their mind, the personification of the North. He's not. He's about as far out on the fringe as you could possibly get. But Southerners believe in their own minds that Brown is really the North. They refer to the John Brown Republicans.
Threatened Southerners joined military companies, and Southern states appropriated funds to purchase arms. Yankees were tarred and feathered or run out of town on a rail. A few were lynched. The support for secession reached a critical mass. On his way to the gallows, John Brown handed a final note to his jailer.
I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away, but with blood.
In the tense and fateful spring of 1860, the presidential election got underway. Just 4 months after the execution of John Brown, the Democratic Convention met in the overheated political atmosphere of Charleston, South Carolina.
By 1860, finally, what in fact had occurred gradually over the 1850s came to a head. It became clear that the Democratic Party was no longer a national party, that there were Northern Democrats and that there were Southern Democrats, and Stephen Douglas's candidacy for the Democratic nomination finally brought it to head.
Douglas's platform advocating popular sovereignty to settle the question of slavery in the territories infuriated Southerners. When it was passed, most of the delegates from Alabama and 7 other Southern states walked out of the convention. The Democratic Party had split in 2. After months of wrangling, the Northern Democrats would give Stephen Douglas the nomination, and the Southern Democrats would nominate their own candidate, John C. Breckinridge. In May, the Republican convention took place in Chicago, Illinois, Abraham Lincoln's home state.
The Republican Party in 1860 is running a candidate for president only for the second time in American history. In the previous election in 1856, they failed to carry 5 key northern states, and they knew that if they could carry those states, they could win. And they needed, in order to carry those states, somebody who was a moderate.
An anti-slavery man, per se, cannot be elected. But a tariff, river and harbor, Pacific Railroad, free homestead man may succeed, although he is anti-slavery.
5 candidates competed for the nomination at the Republican convention. On the first ballot, William Seward led by a strong margin. Lincoln ran second. On the second ballot, Lincoln drew to within several votes of Seward. On the third ballot, Lincoln took the lead, coming within 1.5 votes of the number needed to win the nomination. In the breathless silence, the chairman from Ohio stood on a chair and announced the change of 4 more votes to Lincoln.
There was a rush of great wind in the van of the storm, and in another breath, the storm was there. Thousands cheering with the energy of insanity.
The increasing likelihood that Lincoln would be elected provoked a kind of hysteria in the South. The Republican Party represented an unacceptable threat to slavery and the Southern way of life. In the North, Lincoln and the Republican Party represented the only hope of resisting Southern domination.
I will vote the Republican ticket next Tuesday. The only alternative is everlasting submission to the South. I want to be able to remember that I voted right at this grave crisis. The North must assert its rights now and take the consequences.
The election results reflected the almost complete separation of North and South. Lincoln swept the North, receiving not a single electoral vote in the South. Breckinridge won all of the states of the Deep South. John Bell of the Constitutional Union Party took the border states of Virginia, Kentucky, and Tennessee. And Stephen Douglas, Lincoln's longtime rival, won only Missouri and half of New Jersey. But the electoral votes masked the more complex results of the popular vote.
Bear in mind, in the final results, Lincoln only carried 39% of those who voted. He was very, very much one of the most minority presidents we've ever had.
Lincoln's election triggered an immediate reaction in the South. States began to arm themselves. Thousands joined Southern home guards and state militias. On December 13th, a caucus of Southern states met and issued a proclamation.
The argument is exhausted. All hope of relief in the Union through the agencies of committees, congressional legislation, or constitutional amendments is extinguished.
7 days later, the first state seceded.
We, the people of the state of South Carolina, do declare and ordain that the Union, now subsisting between South Carolina and other states under the name of the United States of America, is hereby dissolved.
Over the next 2 months, South Carolina was followed by Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. But not all the citizens living in the South supported secession.
And so the Rubicon was crossed, and the state of Georgia was launched upon a dark, uncertain, and dangerous sea. The secessionists were jubilant. I never felt so sad before.
When Sam Houston, the governor of Texas, refused to take an oath of loyalty to the Confederacy, he was evicted from the governor's office.
The die has been cast by your secession leaders, and you must ere long reap the fearful harvest of conspiracy and revolution.
On February 8, 1861, in Montgomery, Alabama, delegates from the seceded states founded a new nation. It was called the Confederate States of America. Its elected president was Jefferson Davis.
The time for compromise has now passed. The South is determined to maintain her position and make all who oppose her smell Southern powder and feel Southern steel.
The vice president of the Confederacy was Alexander Stephens.
Our new government rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man. This government is the first in the history of the world based on this great physical and moral truth.
Thank God we have a country at last to live for, to pray for, and, if need be, to die for.
Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis left their respective homes on the same day, Davis departing for Montgomery and Lincoln for Washington, D.C. For Lincoln, the departure was bittersweet. More than half his life had been spent in the town of Springfield, Illinois. He did not know when or if he would see it again. Threatened with assassination, Lincoln slipped into Washington under the cloak of night. On March 4, 1861, he was inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States.
I hold that in contemplation of universal law and of the Constitution, the union of these states is perpetual. I therefore consider that the union is unbroken.
Lincoln never recognized that secession had actually occurred. He always maintained that he was the president of Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi.
His inaugural address was intended as much for Southern as for Northern ears.
Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of their nature.
Old Abe Lincoln was inaugurated today. His speech was just what was expected from him. Stupid, ambiguous, vulgar, and insolent, and is everywhere considered a virtual declaration of war.
By 1861, all efforts at compromise had failed. It seemed as though the unthinkable had now become unavoidable.
I don't think that the Civil War we know, the war from 1861 to 1865 that killed 620,000 soldiers, was inevitable. But in 1858, Senator William H. Seward of New York, a leading Republican, had given a famous speech in which he said there was an irrepressible conflict between a free labor society in the North and a slave labor society in the South. And I do think that's right, that some kind of conflict between these two societies over the future of America was inevitable.
The way I would put it is, at what point in the sectional conflict did the people themselves begin to think, begin to feel that a civil war was inevitable? And I think 1858 is a good candidate for that date. Lincoln's House-divided speech was a speech in the direction of the inevitability of the conflict. More and more people were thinking in terms of warfare, separation in 1858, and it only grew in the next 2 years.
And in this case, you had the Union versus the South. You had two diametrically opposed views, Lincoln believing, like Daniel Webster, that the Union is now and forever, inseparable, one and for all, and the South arguing that secession was a right that they had. You had each side believing that it was absolutely morally correct, that it was absolutely legally correct, and when you had this, you had the stage for war.
As nations cannot be rewarded or punished in the next world, they must be in this. By an inevitable chain of causes and effects, Providence punishes national sins by national calamities.